Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. Today we're going to talk about deep listening. You know, there's so much talk about there about learning how to be a great speaker and a great presenter. Our guest here is going to teach us the opposite, which I think is actually going to make people who are speakers better at what they do, and that is being a great listener. Oscar Trimboli is in Sydney, Australia. He actually came to me through Interview Connections, so shout out to Nathan at Interview Connections for making this connection. And Oscar is on a quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world. Now, just for a moment, just imagine what that would be like if people actually listened, not just heard, but actually listened to each other. That would change the world right there. So I am really, really excited to have him on the show here today. Welcome to Leaders of Transformation, Oscar.
G'day, Nicole.
G'day. I love that. My Aussie friends is awesome. Well, so let me give you. I'll just brag on you a little bit more, so you don't have to, and tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit more about you. So, Oscar was a former marketing director at Vodafone and Microsoft, and he's always been passionate about the importance of listening to customers. And so his team has actually been renowned for that, for the amount of time that they listen to customers in the call center, as well as the market research summaries. And so he actually brought this passion to the next generation leaders at Microsoft, rebuilding their graduate leadership program, which was implemented in 26 countries. As he's passionate about using the gift of listening to bring positive change in workplaces in the world. And despite the fact that 55% of our time is spent listening, it is not a skill that is being taught. In fact, only 2% of people really grasp this topic, despite the astonishing costs of failing to listen. And we'll talk a little bit about those here. So, as I said, we're really excited to have Oscar here with us. We're also excited to have you here as the listener and the viewer, because you're the reason why we do this podcast. This is why we're here, is to inspire you to be the leader of transformation that you're capable of being, whether that is expanding what you're currently doing or launching into something else. Now, you may take something as taken for granted as listening, and that might be your passion. Just like this is a perfect example of Oscar saying, let's take something like listening. It's not complicated, but it's so valuable, and we're going to change the world with that. Maybe you have an idea like that you can bring to the world that will create transformation. So we'd love to hear about that. You can go on leadersoftransformation.com, send us a message. You can find us on social media and find us through leadersoftransformation.com, and or actually on Twitter, it is Leaders Podcast. And so we encourage you just to do that. Reach out to us. Let us know what you're doing, what you're planning to do, how we can support you in that process. Questions that come up as a result of this conversation, please, you can let us know those. You can also, of course, reach out to Oscar. We'll make sure that all of the links so that you can connect with Oscar are going to be on the leadersoftransformation.com if you're driving and don't have an opportunity to write those down. When you go to leadersoftransformation.com, all you need to do is go in the search bar and put Oscar, and his episode is going to come up with the show notes. How easy is that? So with that, let's talk about this all-important topic of deep listening. Let's first of all talk about what it is.
I think for most of us, we know how to see in color, but most of us listen in black and white. And it's basically because we've never been taught, whether that's at school, where we knew our math or our English teacher really well, or maybe it was a sports teacher. But none of us remember our listening teachers. And our listening teachers were really our parents, who were role modeling listening to us, and they'd never been taught. And our teachers, who were role modeling listening to us, they'd never been taught either. So deep listening is the ability to listen beyond the words, to listen to context, to what's unsaid, and ultimately to listen to meaning. It's the ability to understand that there's 5 levels of listening. It's not just what you see and what you hear, but it's also what you feel. It's the energy that the person's transmitting to you and how you notice that, the congruence between their words and their body language. Do they talk in patterns? And are you noticing those patterns while you listen to them? And ultimately, the most powerful level of listening is listening to what's not being said. See, Nicole, there's a really simple rule, the 125-400 rule, that says we speak at 125 words a minute, but we can listen to up to 400 words a minute. And most of us get distracted. In fact, it's happening for you right now. While you're listening to this, you could be out running, you could be in the gym, and right now you might be thinking about what you need to prepare for dinner, or you might think about what you need to do today. And while you're doing that, you're not listening to me. So the difference between a good listener and a deep listener: a good listener gets distracted, doesn't know what to do about it. And a great listener knows they're going to be distracted and has some tactics, some hacks, and some tips to figure out how to get around it. So that's deep listening.
Well, as you were saying that, I muted myself because there's noise in the background and there's things happening. And you're right. It's so easy for us to get distracted. And I love what you said there, just even at the end, there's so much we can unpack there. And we will, talking about the 5 levels of listening and the 125, 400 reel that you were talking about and so forth, and the difference between good and great listeners. What you said there at the end is that, is so valuable, is that you have tools. It's not like deep listeners don't get distracted. They do. We all get distracted. So the goal is not to not ever get distracted, because that's kind of an impossible goal. Things are going to happen. We're going to have that happening around us, but it's what we do with it. And like you said, having tools and practices to develop a better listening skills. So let's talk about, I don't know, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with 5 levels of listening? Does that make the most sense? And by the way, I forgot to mention, before I do that, your book is amazing. So for our listeners and viewers, his book is amazing. In fact, if you follow me on Facebook, I shared the package that I actually got from Oscar through Interview Connections, and there was a box, and I got a little guide that explained what was in the box, and then I got a book, and then I've got cue cards for going through an exercise. Amazing. And so I would highly recommend that little plug for Oscar's box, his book and his cards, is that if you want to have impact beyond your words, then go and get a copy of this book, Deep Listening. And I'm sure you can find it on Amazon and major bookstores and so forth. And of course, Oscar's website. So we'll make sure you get that. But just as a tool, this is a resource tool. This isn't oh, that was interesting. Read it, put it on the bookshelf. He's got questions and he's got practices in here which can help you with this. But anyway, I wanted to mention that as well. So
Thanks,
yeah,
Nicole.
so 5 levels of listening. Let's maybe start there.
Yeah, for a lot of us, understanding the foundations of listening is really important. But for most of us, if we have been taught anything or we've read anything about listening, it's always about being focused and fixated on the person speaking. And although this is interesting, it's not productive, it's not powerful. The first level and the first foundation of listening is listening to yourself. If you've got a whole bunch of dialogue going on in your mind as you're coming into a conversation, so if you're in a workplace where you're moving from meeting to meeting, the likelihood that you've cleared your head from the last conversation to be completely present for the current dialogue you're coming into is really low. If you're moving from one customer meeting to another meeting, or from one supplier meeting to another meeting, you've probably got some conversation playing in your head. So the first level of listening is critical. It's foundational. It's very difficult to access the other 4 levels of listening without understanding that you need to listen to yourself. The 3 hacks I'd recommend are: number 1, the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. Number 2, a hydrated brain is a brain capable of listening. And hack number 3 is switch off your cell phone. So I'm going to talk about the science of each of those, but maybe you've got some questions, Nicole.
Well, when you were saying that, it reminded me of a recent interview I did with Chris Bailey on hyperfocus. And he said a lot of times people come to him because they want productivity hacks. And he said focus and productivity actually has to do with attention. And he talked about something very interesting here, which I think correlates to what you're talking about, is attention residue. We go from one meeting to the next meeting and to the next meeting, one conversation, the next conversation, whatever, one experience, the next experience. And we're bringing all of this with us, and we have to be present to it, get it, that it's there. There's an exercise I learned from one of my mentors, which was at the beginning of every meeting is to ask what I feel like saying. And some people thought, that's stupid. The corporate execs are like, that's dumb. Let's dive into the meeting. But if you don't presence yourself to what you feel like saying and what you feel, what's going on inside, and you're not present to that and what's going on in your brain, it's kind of like an opportunity to release that so that you can actually move forward. So I love this. I think it's so, what you're saying is so important because yes, it's a necessary level, but there's more levels to that. So yeah.
Yeah, it was an amazing piece of research in 1993 in Ottawa, in Canada, that basically examined a range of people who were in conversations, who were chatting to each other. And the research said the most productive conversations had two attributes. Number one, the listener was breathing quite deeper than normal. So basically, the research said the more oxygen you can get to the brain, the more capable the brain is of being focused, disciplined, and engaged in the dialogue rather than distracted from what the person's ultimately trying to say. The second part of this research, which was fascinating, was the most productive conversations out of all the conversations in the research, breathing became synchronized between the speaker and the listener. So if you're really a deep listener and you're really paying attention to what the other person's saying, you'll be noticing their breathing, and ultimately your breathing will be synchronized. We have a telephone suicide counselling hotline in Australia called Lifeline. And basically, these people are taking phone calls from people considering ending their life. And I had the opportunity to interview a couple of these telephone-based counsellors, and they are very deliberate in matching the speed at which the person talks to, which is very closely correlated to the speed at which they're breathing at, and basically bringing them down to a pace where they're not distracted themselves, meaning the speaker, and helping them to deepen their breathing. Now, what I'm not suggesting is all of us need to get into a yoga pose before we go into a conversation around listening. It's not about being separate. It's about integrating your breathing into everything that you do. So as you step from one meeting room to another, just hold your breath for 5 seconds longer and exhale your breath for 5 seconds longer. There's a technique that's used by US Navy SEALs. There's a technique that's used by surgeons who have very long surgery times. It's called box breathing, where they take their breath in, they imagine it's a box, and they create a base in that box, and then they breathe out. And box breathing is taught as a technique in many meditation practices as well. But it draws oxygen as fast as possible to the brain because the breathing depth comes from the diaphragm rather than very shallow from the lungs. So tip number one, be conscious about your breathing. If you're going to a customer, the technique I use, from the time I walk into the lift lobby to the time I arrive at reception, I become completely conscious of my breathing and set the intention, as you just mentioned, Nicole, what will be successful for the person I'm working with right now. So from the time I cross the lobby in a building to the time I get to reception and announce myself, I'm completely focused on my breathing. So from that point on, I'm in a great starting place for that. The second one is a hydrated brain, is a listening brain. The more blood sugars we can get to the brain, the better, because most of us haven't been taught how to listen as a brain task or cognitively. There's a significant load on our brain if we are listening deeply, and more importantly, to stay focused, we need that blood sugars coming up to the brain as well. Now, when I say this, a lot of people joke and say, yeah, there's plenty of water in my morning coffee. And that's great. But just see if you can get through 3 or 4 cups of water a day. And if you can get through a cup of water in a meeting that's important to you, that will help you out there as well. So a hydrated brain is a high performing brain as well.
Well, and coffee is not considered a water substitute.
You'd be surprised how many people in business think it is.
Oh, I know. They'll tell me, did I drink enough water? I've got water in my tea and my coffee. It's like, no, pure water, cleansing your body, like you said, coming up into your brain and hydrating you.
Yeah. And look, the final technique is about distraction and switching off your cell phone and announcing that you're going to switch off your cell phone. For a lot of people, this may be a struggle, but I saw this technique illustrated beautifully in about 2012, where a visiting Microsoft executive who ran an organization with tens of billions of dollars, 55,000 employees, and I was hosting him and a series of customer meetings. He'd come straight off the plane, a 14-hour flight from the US to Australia, and we were walking into a room of 12 customers, all CEOs of local organizations here. Before he started, he simply said, "Oh, forgive me, I've forgotten to switch off my phone." He literally orchestrated it like a conductor, removed it from his coat pocket, put it in his hand, switched it off, and then put it in his travel bag. And what do you think happened for the rest of the room, Nicole? What do you think the rest of the attendees did as a result?
Well, they followed suit. It's so funny because a lot of times speakers will say, please silence your phone. And it's one thing to tell somebody to do something, and it's another thing to set the example to do it yourself. And for sure, I'm sure that they all followed suit and did that.
Yeah, about a third of the room followed suit. And it was really noticeable that Peter did this at every meeting. And I'm sure he still does this today, but he's role modeling the fact that for this hour, 45 minutes, whatever the time frame is, he was completely present and focused on the people in front of them. And look, for some of us, we've become so addicted to our devices, we may find that hard to do. There is a grayscale option that will switch off your notifications so that your red dots don't buzz and beep and things like that on your phone. So if you're looking for a transition strategy and you think going cold turkey is just too hard, then use the grayscale function in your phone. So what you're doing, like any great athlete, like any great musician, you are preparing yourself for the performance of listening. So an Olympic level athlete doesn't just turn up on the day of the Olympics for their race. There is significant practice that goes into that. They're developing muscles that will be ready to be used on the day. And the same is true for listening.
That's so interesting. And I wonder how, I know for myself, I never thought about it much. And when I started getting into business and I realized I needed to build relationships and I was getting communication feedback back that was like, no, I'm trying to sell something, right? No, 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 no. And I'm thinking, okay, how do I connect with them more effectively? And I just naturally realized that if I were just to listen to them, they would tell me what they needed and they would tell me what was important to them. And it was just so much easier. But I had to learn the skill first of listening and silencing, like you talk about silencing our own mind, thinking about all the agendas. And even teaching coaches, I've had coaches saying, okay, what's this format? What's the this? What's that? And it's like, I'll teach all that, but what's more important is your ability to be present with the person that you're coaching and to hear what you said, what's not being said, all the different nuances, everything that's going on beyond the words, which are 7% of our communication are our words. And 93% of it is tone and body language. And then, of course, you talk about there's not even just that, there's all these other ways. But I think actually before you go into the rest of the levels, I think it would be helpful to talk about the cost of listening, the cost of not listening more accurately.
And the cost is massive. We look at Professor Avi Kluger out of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in Israel. He's done an amazing piece of research where he's studied every piece of listening research. And what was really clear is that in the field of medicine, an example of not listening is most doctors interrupt the patient within 18 seconds of the consultation. So you
Wow.
walk in, the doctor says, "What brings you here today?" or whatever phrase they use, on average. So this is the average, 18 seconds. Now, doctors who didn't interrupt at up to the 90-second mark, which isn't really long, disproportionately less legal claims against them, less medical malpractice suits. Patients were healing themselves faster. When we look at sales professions, it's the salespeople who listen more effectively outperform the average by 2.5 times in their sales output. Modern technology gives us some interesting insights. An organization in the US recorded 25,400 phone calls using computer software, and it measured the talk and listen ratio across the first third, middle third, and last third of the phone call. And basically, it said on average, highest performing sales reps listened for 54% of the time and 46% of the time speaking on average. Yet at the beginning of the call, their listen ratio was much, much higher. And towards the end of the call, their speak ratio was a little bit higher. But in this research that was done with computer software, the highest performing sales reps were outperforming the average by nearly 2.5 times again. So when we look at organizations, one of my favorite stories is Lego. In
Oh, yes.
2000,
I remember that story. You told me that. I wanted you to cover that.
in 2000, Lego was effectively going broke. It had been overtaken by the computer age, and children were now more engaged with computer games than they were with Lego. But there was a really deep, passionate community called the Adult Friends of Lego. These were people who'd grown up with Lego and meet every Saturday, once a month, to construct Lego and have Lego competitions and show their Lego constructions off to each other. But by 2000, Lego had been going broke. Lego had some theme parks around the world that they had to sell off. And Lego thought they needed to develop a Lego movie, which was called The Adventures of Crash Craddock. And unless you are a hardcore Lego fan, you have never actually heard of this movie. You've heard of subsequent movies, but not that one, because this movie grossed $69,000 through DVD sales and box office takings. Didn't even come close to covering 1/10 of the production cost. But the Lego CEO did something very skillful at that point in time. He went and found two movie directors and producers, Lord and Miller. They were relatively young and unknown. Their greatest claim to fame was a movie called 21 Jump Street, which was a US telemovie, but it never made anything in the box office. But what Lord and Miller did was they went to every single European, Asian, and North American Lego meetup club on Saturdays over a period of about 3 months, and they listened really deeply. They listened so deeply, in fact, they noticed that there's some evil people in the Lego community. And these people use glue. Now, I don't know a lot about Lego, but apparently using glue in Lego is bad. I can understand why now that someone took the time to explain it to me, because it's a once-off use of the Lego. But that ended up becoming a subplot in the movie. And because they were listening to the adult fans of Lego as they developed the movie, the adult fans of Lego started to become passionate advocates for the movie as it came out. They ran their own screenings, they recruited non-Lego fans in to watch the movie, and this movie series became a blockbuster. It led to a series of 11 movies. It created a $1 billion plus movie franchise. It created a $1 billion plus computer games franchise for Lego, and it also increased Lego sales because it created a new group of fans who watched the movie, who were young kids, who grew the Lego sales as well. So a really simple example, if you don't pay attention to your customers, they'll go away, as Lego fans were. But if you really deeply engage with the most passionate parts of that community, they'll become advocates for you as well. And that's one simple example of not only the cost of not listening, but how to add billions of dollars into a huge global organization just by listening a little bit longer to their fans.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me of, so I teach this invisible to power model, and there's like the phases of business, right? So you start off and you're invisible, and a lot of times what happens is people think, okay, I know what people want, right? So then they release, so there's this thing, this creation of theirs, they have this idea and they release it to the market, and then they wonder why the market's not interested in it. So there's that, but there's actually, first of all, the first step, because what's the first step in starting a business is actually listening, asking questions and listening to your audience, listening to the market, to what they want. But the reason why I brought that up is that when you get to the top level of being in a position of power where you're dominating your market, right? The biggest challenge, because each one, of course, there's things to watch for, right? Pitfalls to watch for. And the biggest thing to watch for when you're at that level is arrogance, to think that you now know what other what your audience wants, and rather than listening. So that's a good example of it with Lego, is that they weren't listening to what was important, and they lost that market share, potentially could have gone under had they not listened. And how often do we hear that? It's kind of like with Starbucks. I remember in, was it 2008? I think Howard Schultz came on end of 2007, somewhere in there, but they closed a whole bunch of stores. And it's like, wow, because you know what? You got to listen to the market. The market, like here in the US, they went through this market crash. We don't need a Starbucks in every corner, right? Like the people are having a hard time paying their mortgages. They're not probably buying as many $5 coffees. So again, listening to the market help them to sustain themselves through that process by saying, you know what, we need to make some adjustments here, and so forth. So yeah, I see how that cost. And then of course, personally, even in your personal relationship, you're not listening to people. I mean, I think that there's a big difference between listening and being heard. And when you were talking about people healing faster, and I'm thinking, why would that be that someone would heal faster? But it's like we're being nurtured. It's like this intimacy, this connection, this human connection that we need, that is being filled through actually having somebody hear you and pay attention. So very, very powerful. Now there's
Dr. Daniel Offrey out of New York has written an amazing book. If you want to learn more about this topic, Nicole, it's called What Doctors Say and What Patients Hear. And it's an amazing example of doctors who are treating patients as people versus treating them as patients. So what Dr. Offrey says is that if you can recruit the patient in the journey of their own treatment, and if they're more engaged in it because you've listened to what it means to them, they'll be moving much faster towards their solution. So one thing might be is if somebody has a back injury, or one thing might be to say, here's a treatment plan to get your back fixed. The skillful doctor who will listen for meaning will ask a very simple question: when your back's fixed, what will you be able to do with that you can't now? Well, it means that I can pick up my grandchildren, or it means I can play golf with my buddies. So then the treatment plan becomes about How do we get you playing golf with your buddies faster? How do we get you picking up your grandchildren faster rather than fixing your back? And it's a very small distinction, but that's where the power comes in, because it's what matters to them, not what their current pain is or their treatment problem.
That's profound. Yeah. Yeah. And I was even thinking about, why do they have it? When did the back problems start in the first place? What triggered it? And what's the cause of it? And so much more richness that can come out of that, rather than just diagnosing a symptom and saying, okay, here's what you do. So yeah, and creating a treatment plan. Very powerful. So let's talk about, oh my gosh, seriously, for our listeners and viewers, you got to get a copy of his book, because there's so much more in this. We're not going to be able to cover it all today. I'm just going to tell you right now, because we'll be here for a while. And my cat wants to show up and say hello too. So he likes to, he's paying.
What's your cat's name?
Chess. Yeah, they named him, I adopted him, and the name they had given him was Cheshire. And I was like, I'm not going to call my cat Cheshire. No, yeah, that's not going to happen. So I immediately shortened it to Chess. And he's a love bug. He's a total love bug. And he likes to be nice and close and cuddle. And the only problem with it is I've had lots of people who said, you need to bring him on the podcast, and cat videos are all the bomb and so forth. The problem is he also likes to jump on the desk, and then everything shakes, and rub up against the mic and so that part doesn't work for me. So, and I don't think would work for our listeners as well, and or viewers as well, if the thing's shaking all the time. But yeah, he just woke up and he's like, hey, what are you all doing up there? So yeah, let's talk about those listeners. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let me throw a listening challenge out to you.
Sure.
Why don't you listen to your audience and put a Facebook post up, and maybe you do a one-off episode, questions you'd love to ask Chess, and just have some fun with that, rather than blocking why you can't do it. Think about why you could do it.
That's a great idea. Yeah. What questions? Just from Chess. Right now he's wondering, how does he get to the squirrel in the outside? How do I get out there? That's a great idea. Actually, that could be a lot of fun. Yeah. Very cool.
I've got a 10-year-old spoodle, which is a spaniel and a poodle cross, called Killy. And Killy's short for Kilimanjaro. And my wife and I were trekking and training to climb Kilimanjaro back in 2008. And my wife decided, maybe she won't go. And then I said, well, you've been talking about this dog you always wanted. Maybe if we train and we summit, you can get your dog. And from that point on, I'd never seen a more focused person training for our climbs to Kilimanjaro. So he teaches me a lot about listening. He teaches me a lot about presence and greeting with intention when somebody shows up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So you mountain climb. So tell us a little bit about that.
Maybe more adventures. Kilimanjaro's a mountain you can walk up. It's not a mountain you require ropes or boots or anything really, significant. But we've been to Nepal, and we've been to New Guinea, and we've been to Tanzania as a group, both for fundraising and with friends. And we kind of want to set ourselves a challenge to kind of keep us going during the year. There's lots of excuses you can make for not exercising, but if you've got an event or a goal to work towards, that becomes really important. In the last decade, that's been substituted by half marathons, marathons, ultra marathons, and ocean swim programs, where we're part of a cancer fundraising group that helps first-time people get from the couch to a half marathon, or the couch to a 1K or a 2K ocean swim in Australia. Sometimes that can be a little bit more daunting, because we have plenty of sharks in the ocean in Australia as well.
Yeah, I think I'll pass on the sharks, but I've known a few people that have climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. One of my mentors, Blair Singer, actually takes teams up there every year, and yeah, it's never been a desire of me to climb a mountain, but it's really more of the cliff hanging that I'm not really interested in.
Yeah.
If I'm gonna die doing something adventurous, it's gonna be in a car driving really fast.
Well,
It's very interesting.
that's the great
Falling
thing
off.
about Kilimanjaro. You can literally, there's no cliffs, there's nothing remotely close to that. It's a wide path the whole way. It's the most accessible of the highest continental mountains in the world. And yeah, hey, you'll need to train, but if your cliff hanging is an issue for you, you're not going to have that on Kilimanjaro.
And nobody's ever told me that. That's interesting. They just talk about how extraordinary it is, but I guess I never listened enough and asked questions enough to know if you had to be cliff hanging and so forth. So I might actually consider that then. But because I do love the hiking and the, and going up there and experiencing that. But yeah, it's very
You will never forget sunrise on summit morning, because
mm,
you leave at about midnight to summit, so you can reach the summit at sunrise, and that's quite an extraordinary experience.
mm, beautiful. Well, talking about, let's bring it back to extraordinary experiences. I know that you've got 5 levels of deep listening. We've covered one, talked about some of the other ones. Walk us through the other 4.
Sure. So listening for content is where most literature is focused on. A great body of literature evolved in the 80s and 90s around active listening. And I'm always curious about a term that's got the word active in front of it, because you don't need to actively breathe, and you just breathe. And paraphrasing is interesting, but if you're doing that with the wrong intention, if you're doing that in a way that is about you rather than about them, then listening and actively listening is kind of like the equivalent of taking selfies all day. It's all about you rather than about them. So, listening for content, um, Chinese have this character called ting, and ting means to listen. So, listening is a very active process in Chinese history. Ting evolved from teaching the next generation of emperors how to listen in the court of what would be the government at that time. And the great mentors and scholars of the era taught the up and coming leaders how to listen. And listening to the content, typically in the West, we listen two-dimensionally. We listen through our eyes and we listen through our ears. But in China, they talk about another 4 levels of content, and listening for feeling, listening for focus, it is really quite crucial in the way your intention needs to be when you listen to content at a deeper level. So, what you want to do is start to listen to how they breathe and listen for their energy. I recently spoke to a really interesting millennial leader. Her name was Holly Ransom, and she got to interview Barack Obama when he came to Australia. And she said when she listened to him, the level of his energy and conviction in his language was completely different to any other politician she'd engaged with over the 10 years that she'd been interviewing leaders globally. So, one of the things to do when you're listening to the content, well, you're listening to what energy is coming back. You're listening to how long people are pausing between the time they have an idea and the time they speak. And you're treating silence as if it is another word and giving it complete attention. So, a lot of us don't treat silence like a word in the West. We treat silence like it's a commercial break for us to interrupt who's speaking. In high context cultures, Japan, Korea, China, silence is used by the speaker to describe nuance, to describe depth. So it's a language technique, but in the West, we just kind of steamroller over it. So beyond listening to words and listening to body language, listen to energy and listen to silence. They're the levels of listening at level 2 that most of us in the West don't pay enough attention to.
So, focus. When you talk about listening at the level of focus, um, I'd like you to unpack that. And then when you talk about the pause, I remember one of my mentors used to say the power is in the pause.
Mm.
And so maybe talk a little bit more about that piece, because like you're right, in the US, North America here, we tend to, I can't speak for the whole world, you've been around the world and teaching on this subject. But yeah, we fill it with ums. We it's almost like it's bad to have silence. That's so. And like you said, it's a commercial break to interrupt, or it's a filler. People come home and all they do is want to put their TV on, so that they have noise in the background. To me, I don't want noise in the background. I've got enough conversations and noise happening. Great stuff, but I like silence. I like quiet so that I can actually think and formulate my thoughts. That's the listening to yourself in a way, right? So, but yeah, talk about that. Talk about that level of focus. What what am I focusing on?
Mm. So good listeners listen to the speaker, and great listeners listen to the dialogue. The dialogue is the interplay between the two of you. So imagine you're in a helicopter or a balcony above the conversation and watching it. Are you focusing on this conversation being a conversation that's moving in the right direction for both the speaker and the listener? Because the dialogue is the intersection of two parties in a conversation. The dialogue is not just what the speaker is saying. It's about the intersection of what we're both saying, and are we both moving forward on that? So a really simple focus question may be, are we moving forward at the pace you imagined? Another focus question could be, given the time we've got left, how would you like to use that? And these questions are completely independent of whatever's being discussed. You can use these questions in pretty much any context. And it gives the speaker the opportunity to pause and reflect. And in a lot of cases, they'll use code words. They'll say, look, what's really important for me in this dialogue is, what really matters to me for our time remaining is, you know what? I've probably spoken too much about that. What we need to talk about is this. These code words help you understand that you're focused on progressing the conversation or the dialogue rather than just allowing the speaker to speak infinitely. There is a time to stop listening. So the difference between a good listener and a great listener is they will help the dialogue reach progress and conclusion rather than it just being a mind dump. It's a fine balance. But the focus is about focusing on the dialogue, not just focusing on the speaker or yourself. It's the intersection of the two. That's where the focus needs to be.
Yes, and as a podcast host, this is that fine line between when somebody's actually sharing a story and they're building, something and developing something, and allowing them to do that versus cutting in and breaking the flow in the conversation. It's also, I've noticed, I had a guest on who we actually got disconnected. The internet broke off, and we had to restart. And it was actually hard for us to restart because we had flow. Like, I feel like it's like this dance, right? And all of a sudden, you disconnect, and now you got to go back in. The flow's different. So it took us a few minutes to get back into that flow of the conversation as to where we were. And because that was an interruption, that was a distraction, one of those things that stepped in the way of that, and it broke the connection.
And that's a great timely example of level 3, listening for the context. So you listen to the content, but you listen for the context. Context is the backstory. It's what brings us to the conversation, both as a speaker, listener, and what the situation is we're talking about. And you gave a great example there where if you're not connected all the way through the conversation and there's a disconnection, you have to go back to the story and reconnect and start all over again. So for a lot of us who know we will be distracted because we're filling 300 words in our head while the speaker is speaking, one of the hacks to think about is, what patterns am I noticing in the way they're speaking? So some people speak in pictures, stories, models, metaphors. Some people speak in detail, sequence, logic, evidence. Some people speak about the past. Some people speak a lot about the future. Some people speak a lot about themselves, or they speak a lot about others. Some people love to speak about their weekdays. Some people love to speak about their weekends. Are you listening enough that you can notice the patterns that they're speaking in, so you can help them explore what patterns are useful and productive for them and which ones aren't? A lot of this is hard-coded in people's assumptions. Assumptions are the brain shortcuts, so we don't have to figure out, if I step out of my bed in the morning, if I get out of my chair, if I step out of my car, if I walk out of my elevator, none of us have to calculate what the mathematical formula is for gravity every time we do that. We have a mental assumption that on Earth we will have gravity. And in most cases, that's useful. But if you're a scientist who's calculating things for scientists who are traveling around the moon, or fixing the Hubble Space Telescope, they have to do a lot of furious calculations to figure out the fact that that assumption isn't true outside of the Earth. And in a lot of our conversations, we are not clear on the context. We're not clear both the backstories and the patterns for that person. So again, a really simple question to help somebody with is, hey, Nicole, I'm curious if you've noticed any patterns in the way I speak today. Now, that's a rhetorical question. I'm not putting you on the spot. But in asking the speaker to notice any patterns, quite often they'll notice patterns you haven't even noticed. And in noticing those patterns, you can simply say, will they be helpful for the rest of the conversation? And sometimes they'll say yes, and sometimes they'll say no, but it's surfacing these assumptions so they get the context of what this is. The other way you can break the context is, if you had to explain this to my 5-year-old granddaughter Ruby, how would you explain this? Or if you had to explain this to a 75-year-old person who's never had exposure to technology, how would you explain this? If we had to come back in 100 years, what will be the most crucial thing we need to think about? If the chairman of the board was here right now, if a customer was in the room right now, what would they say we need to be focusing on in this conversation?
Well, and it's a lot to think about when you're in a conversation with someone and still say present. So here you're trying to be present with somebody and really hear all the things that are going on. In the meantime, you've got all these things to notice, patterns. You know, I notice you're very auditory, right? And you're looking, you're hearing, right? And so different things. So it's noticing all those things, but how do you, so if you're a leader, our leaders of transformation listening, entrepreneurs, aspiring leaders, and they're like, okay, well, where do I start with all this? I mean, it can be a bit overwhelming.
Yeah. And I would say at the level of context, it's simply for you to help stay in the dialogue, to stop being distracted, is just go into the conversation and go, I'm going to notice very simply, are they anchored in the past or the future? That's a really simple starting point for you to think about the conversation. Because I'll be honest, a lot of these techniques I've explained is I'm literally walking around every part of the gym and explaining all the equipment you could use. Now, what we want is a program for you in the gym so that you're not going to quit the listening gym in the first week because it's all too hard. Thus, those really 3 simple tips. Breathe more deeply, drink water, switch off your cell phone. For most people, that's going to be more than enough to move the depth of their listening forward. Over the last 6 months, I've researched 1,462 people, and most people are only capable of listening at level 1. 86% of people are listening at level 1. They can't get out of the jibber jabber in their head and the stories they're making up before they even come to the conversation. So just becoming present is really powerful. So think of the levels of listening as a pyramid with an apex at the top, but we've got to get the foundations in place first. And the wider the base, the higher the apex. So for everybody out there who's a leader of transformation, just start there. Breathe more deeply, drink more water, switch off your cell phone. All these other more advanced techniques we explore in my book, and the playing cards and the jigsaw puzzle and the podcast series, and soon to be the mobile app as well. But for most of us, Nicole, just start there.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think that if we even just a few percentages on that whole, we'd see a huge impact from there. So yeah, so much that we could be talking about. You mentioned jigsaw puzzle, and I perked up and I'm like, oh my gosh, he's got a jigsaw puzzle too. And you got so many cool things. And I love your mission that, you want 100 million deep listeners in the world by, I think it's 2030 goal. And you're out there doing it. So I'm going to encourage our listeners that are out there, our viewers that you've been listening to this via video, that if this has piqued your interest, you can help to make this reality, this vision a reality, this mission of 100 million deep listeners by sharing the information. Share this interview, send people to his website and get the book. I really do encourage you to do that. Not because he needs to sell another book, because I'm pretty sure that Oscar's not worried about selling another book. This is not what this is about. It's the unsaid is this has nothing to do with the book. This has nothing to do with the cards. This has to do with the impact. And what I love about this is, what a great statement. Sometimes, and here I'm doing it, but sometimes it's like we use so many words to say something when fewer words can have greater impact. And your tagline, deep listening, impact beyond words. It's right there. It says it in a few short words, says what you're all about. And that's the goal. So yeah, I really appreciate you being here. And as I said, there's so many more questions. I know there's the 4 villains for deep listening. And you know what? I'm going to suggest to our audience, go get the book, go to Oscar's website. He's got some information on there. OscarTrimboli.com is his website. And you can get all that information there, because this is the tip of the iceberg to a starting point to really learning how to deep listen. Now, before we finish, Oscar, is there anything that you want to finish off with, something that's important to you that you want to be able to share with our audience?
It's a client story. Someone I was working with 2 years ago. His name was Mike, and I'd only been working with him for 2 months. And he rang me up and said, "You've got a lot to answer for, Oscar. You nearly caused a divorce last night." And I was like completely shocked. And I said to him, "Look, Mike, I explained to you these are all workplace techniques and not to be used at home. This work and body of work that I've done is all in the context of a workplace." And I said, "I'm curious what happened that you would say this." And he said, "My wife pulled me aside after we'd had dinner last night and wanted to know who I was having an affair with." And I was completely knocked off my chair. And because I'd applied your techniques, and rather than try and defend it, I just asked her, "How have you arrived at this assumption?" And she said, "In the last 2 months, you've never, ever paid me this much attention in my whole marriage. What's going on?" And I could only come to the conclusion that you were having an affair and trying to cover something up.
Wow. That's amazing. Actually, and what you just said there, it was so funny, because you said, you're not supposed to use this outside the workplace. Of course, that's certainly what you want people to do. But oh my gosh, that's amazing.
So people ask you to listen to them, but what they really crave is to be heard.
Mm.
So if you can hear what really matters to them, you'll make a complete change. And what Mike's said to me, that their relationship is transformed as a result, as a husband and wife, but more importantly to him and his wife, their relationship with their children is completely transformed, because they spend their dinners listening to each other now, and it's a really fun and interesting place rather than a process of eating, which it was in the past.
I love that story. And I think of the impact, and that's what I was alluding to, the impact of your teaching in the workplace. And from the workplace, it goes to the home, it goes to the next generation. The reason why we don't have great listeners right now is because they weren't taught to be great listeners. As you mentioned, the listening coach, the parent, the well-meaning parent, and I get that people are well-meaning, but so busy doing things, distracted. What have you got? Okay, yep, nope. Problem solving, right? Taking the workplace into home. Okay, you need to problem solve. Next. Okay, you get your shoes on. You get this. We got to go. All this stuff. And when kids actually, they just want to be heard. And yeah, so very powerful. The ripple effect. You can't even calculate it. Oscar, from this material that you're sharing, and the passion, heart in which you're sharing it. So thank you.
Thanks for listening.
It's a pleasure. And to our listeners and our viewing audience, I encourage you go to oscartrimboli.com and check out his book. As I said, it's called Deep Listening. You can find it on Amazon. I'm sure all the major bookstores. You can also find it on his website. We'll have all the links in the show notes. And if you're in an organization and you're in those boardrooms and you're thinking, oh my goodness, we need to start implementing some of this. First of all, start off with yourself. Start you implementing it. That's a great place to begin. And then invite Oscar to come and speak to your organization. Listen to his podcast. He's got a lot of tools. And I think that's a testament of him listening to his audience and what is important, what people need to be able to implement this information. Highly encourage you. I think it would transform organizations. It'll transform relationships and the quality of our life. So I encourage you to do that. I'm a big believer in taking action. You can learn, you can hear all this stuff. It's all good. But it's when you actually apply it that it makes the difference. So I encourage you that. Look forward to hearing the stories of how this has impacted you personally, professionally, and in the quality of your life. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, keep making a difference out there and being the leader transformation that you're capable of being.